Indeed, not a single English or American sailor or traveler captured at sea by North African pirates between 1600 and 1775 described himself or herself as a white slave, or even as white, in over 36 published memoirs. Instead, they described themselves as Christian captives, as Christian slaves, and frequently as English slaves. To be a white slave was to be a Muslim, and if born in Europe, to be someone who had converted to Islam, a so-called renegade. To be a white slave was to be a Muslim, and if born in Europe, to be someone who had converted to Islam. To be a white slave or a white servant in North America in the 1680s was likewise to be understood as a trafficked subject. To be a white slave or a white servant in North America in the 1680s was likewise to be understood as a trafficked subject. A migrant whose whiteness marked his or her fungibility, their capacity to be bought and sold, rather than their rights as a political subject.
You hear that?
So this is not what I expected. Not at all what I expected. The argument being that white racial grammar was not born white supremacist. It became that way. So then the question becomes how and why. What led to that evolution and the creation of an ideology of white victimhood and white power?
And what did the elite do when you see that you're outnumbered by black and white folks who are penniless, landless, peasants? You have to do one of two things. You either have to kill them all, but you can't do that because who's going to work? Rich folks weren't going to. They had to get poor people to work. The whole point was to be a person of leisure back in those days. That was the goal, was not to work. So you couldn't kill them all. You didn't want to kill them all. You had to do the work yourself. You had to build your own levee, build your own house. No. Pick your own tobacco, harvest your own cotton. No, we're not going to do any of that. So you can't kill them, but you can co-opt them. And so the elite in Virginia, for example, in the colony, begins to give certain carrots to people of European descent, saying things like, you know, we're going to let you own a little land. Not much, but just a little. And we're going to get rid of indentured servitude. Now you're free labor. And by the way, once you're free labor, you get 50 acres of land. Just because you're free labor, see? So we're going to cut you in on this deal. We're going to let you enter into contracts. We're going to let you testify in court. And here's the best of all. We're going to put you on the slave patrol to keep those people in line, right? The idea was you're still going to get your clock clean. We still don't like you. We still aren't going to really empower you or change your economic subordination. But we're going to make you honorary members of this team, and you're going to help us keep those other people down. So they got a little taste of power, and it did effectively divide and conquer those coalitions. Those rebellions began to stop almost instantly.
Black History Month you find
ridiculous.
Why?
You're going to relegate my history to a month?
Oh, come on.
What do you do with yours? Which month is White History Month? No, well, come on, tell me.
Well, I'm Jewish.
Okay, which month is Jewish History Month?
There isn't one.
Oh, why not?
Yeah.
Do you want one?
No.
I don't either. I don't want a Black History Month. Black history is American history.
How are we going to get rid of racism?
Stop talking about it. I'm going to stop calling you a white man.
Yeah.
And I'm going to ask you to stop calling me a black man.
What do you think, Morgan? Is this political correctness gone too far?
Yeah. I mean, we have a tendency to do that anyway. I mean, you get politically correct. Stuff happens that you don't want to happen. I all of a sudden became an African. Political correctness, African American. I'm not African. An American. I'm not African. An American. I'm not African.
Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. That's right. It says advertisements for runaway slaves occasionally contain information which sheds light on racial terms. The term mulatto is sometimes used for persons whose background cannot be documented, but very often American ancestry is specifically indicating the saying that these are American natives or aboriginals who they're talking about when they're referencing a mulatto. In the following examples from Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, references to Americans held as slaves will also be included, along with those specifically using the term mulatto. We shall begin with Virginia. 1737, 1738. Amos, a mulatto man, slave. He is about 6 feet high with broad face and shoulders, has bushy hair, and is a native of this country, although he has the countenance of a Madagascar. You hear that? Alright, so a mulatto man slave, a native of this country.
And just so you can see that these advertisements are not fake, just want to show you some real ones. So it says here, $10 reward, ran away from her subscriber on the 15th instant, a Negro girl named Nellie, 16 years of age, stout built, rather short, yellow complexion. Again, yellow complexion. Who was called the yellow man? Yellow complexion, long Indian hair, curled before hold but rather down looking. Alright, Amy Cheston. This is from 1809.
This is from the Johns Hopkins University Studies in Historical and Political Science by Herbert B. Adams. He's the editor. It says History and Past Politics and Politics of Present History. Freeman. 14th series says the 4th and the 5th, Slavery and Servitude in the Colony of North Carolina by John Spencer Bassett, PhD, Professor of History and Political Science in Trinity College, North Carolina. And this is back from 1896 by the John Hopkins Press, all right, 1896. Continuing the book, it says, in the early period of North Carolina, there was continual complaint that people harbored runaway servants, all right, runaway servants. Governor Nicholson made the charge in 1691, and Edward Randolph, Surveyor General, repeated the charge in 1696. The situation of North Carolina was favorable to Virginia runaways, and it is likely that when servants left their masters in that province, they took refuge in the swamps and the forests to the southward. Who? Servants, not African slaves. But there is nothing to show that North Carolina encouraged such runaways. Henderson Walker wrote in 1699 that the law for apprehending runaway Negroes was adequate. He must have referred to the law we find on the statute book in 1715. By that law, we learn that any Christian servant who ran away from his master should, on being captured, be compelled to serve above his regular period of servitude, double the time he was away, and in addition such longer time as the court should deem sufficient to repay the master for whatever damage he may have sustained. This provision was incorporated in the law of 1741. As many servants ran away in North Carolina itself as in Virginia, it seems John Ernstone, who seems here to have had nothing to gain by an exaggeration, said in 1716, white servants are seldom worth the keeping and never stay out of the time indented for. Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. 1752, runaway from Somerset County, Maryland, a tall, slim mulatto man, slave, looks much like unto an Indian, and will endeavor to pass for such, had with him a stripped Indian match coat. You hear that? So they're saying that this mulatto man looks much like unto an Indian. He looks very much like an Indian, and will try to pass like one. He is one. Hear what he's saying? Because if they classify him as an Indian, then he wouldn't be able to enslave him. But as a Negro, since that became almost synonymous with slave, then if you see him as a Negro, then it's okay for him to enslave him, and he has the right to write in his mind, right? 1772, ran away, a dark mulatto man, slave named Manuel, about 5 feet 9 inches high, 30 years of age, and has bushy hair. He has been used to go by water, has much the appearance of a sailor, and is a tolerably good shoemaker. He was born in the Spanish West Indies, speaks Spanish fluently.
Butte County, North Carolina, March 20, 1775. Runaway from the subscriber, a slave of the Indian breed. breed, a tall, slim-made fellow with long, straight black hair. About 23 years of age.
In the book, Redemptioners and Indentured Servants in the Colony and Commonwealth of Pennsylvania by Carl Frederick Geiser from 1901. And this is chapter 8. All right, the Runaways is like around page 89. The Runaways, right? So we thought it was always African slaves running away, but you know, the white slaves did this actually a lot. The indentured servants and white slaves did this a lot. Question of runaway servants seemed to have been one of the most difficult with which the authorities and masters had to deal. The Pennsylvania newspapers of the time devoted no small amount of space to notices of runaways, so the newspapers at that time were full of these runaway ads. It is difficult to find a single issue of the Packet or Gazette during the period in which the system was in full force that does not contain several notices, and sometimes over a column is devoted to these advertisements. $20 hard reward, a half Johannes reward, are some of the various captions that stand out in boldface type to attract the notice of the reader. Rough woodcuts were sometimes inserted beside the notice to make it more conspicuous, the fugitive being usually represented in colonial custom with a cane and a bundle over his shoulder, taking rapid strides across the country. These notices throw a great deal of light on the internal history of indentured service. They give a complete description of the servant, his character, nationality, age, the clothing, and often the time of service. As the return of the servant depended largely upon the accuracy of the description, it is an invaluable source from which a perfect picture of the dress, manner, and character of at least a part of the servant class may be derived. A single example from the Pennsylvania Gazette on May 9, 1751, may here serve as a characteristic illustration. And it says, from that time, an ad, right? It says, "Runaway from Thomas James of Upper Merion, Philadelphia County. On the 5th of this inst, an Irish servant, lad named William Dubbin, about 18 years of age, speaks good English, fresh-colored and thick and well set in his body, has light-colored curled hair, somewhat resembling a wig, had on when he went away an old felt hat, Ozenbrick shirt, an old dark brown colored coat, too big for him, and breeches of the same, gray worsted stockings, and a pair of old shoes with brass buckles. One of the buckles broke. Whoever takes up and seizes this servant so that his master may have him again shall have 20 shillings reward, and reasonable charges paid by Thomas Jones." Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. 1772. Ran away from Cumberland a mulatto man named Jim, who is a slave of the name of Cheshire, and very likely will call himself James Cheshire or Chink. He has long black hair resembling an Indian's. Okay. 1773. Ran away with a Negro fellow named Fortune, a wench named Aminta. Has much the look of an Indian, and is so, her mother having been brought from Spanish Main to Rhode Island, has long black hair. They were brought from Rhode Island. The Journal of Negro History by Carter G. Woodson, Volume 1. Says here in this book, ran away from his master, Eliezer Ting, or Eliezer, Esquire, at Dunstable. On the 26th of May, they passed a Negro man. Again, a Negro man, right? Remember that. Servant called Robin, almost of the complexion of an Indian. So he just said he's a Negro man, but he has the complexion of an Indian. You see this? Short, thick, square shoulder, the fellow, a very short neck and thick legs, about 28 years old. Talks good English, can read and write, and plays on the fiddle. He was born at Dunstable. Whoever will apprehend said Negro and secure him, again, whoever will apprehend said Negro who has the complexion of an Indian, and secure him so that his master may have him again, or bring him to the warehouse of Messrs. Alford and Ting in Boston, shall have a reward of £10, all tenor, and all reasonable charges. And this was published in the New York Gazette, revived in the Weekly Post, Boy, July 18, 1748. Again, a Negro servant runaway with a complexion of an Indian.
Runaway from the subscriber in Albemarle, a mulatto slave called Sandy. Again, a mulatto slave called Sandy. We're just talking about American natives. About 35 years of age, his stature is rather low, inclining to corpulence, and his complexion light. Again, his complexion light. He is a shoemaker by trade, in which he uses his left hand principally. All right, and it goes on. All right, in another book from the Johns Hopkins University Studies in Historical and Political Science, and this is White Servitude in Maryland, 1634 to 1820 by Eugene Irvin McCormick, PhD, instructor in American History, University of California, and this is from 1904. As nearly all indentures were negotiable, they were regularly disposed of at auction or private sale. The following is an example of the notices which appeared in the papers whenever a servant ship arrived in port. It says here, just arrived in the ship Sophia, Alexander Berdine, master from Dublin, 20 stout, healthy, indented men servants with 20 people, it says, whose indentures will be disposed of on reasonable terms by the captain on board or the subscriber, etc. The price received for servants varied according to their skill, age, and other personal qualities, but the average price for adults seems to have been about 15 to 20 pounds, all right? People from Europe being sold, right? Like property, people being sold. All right, we're continuing the book, White Servitude in Maryland, 1634 to 1820 by Eugene Irvin McCormick from the, Johns Hopkins University Historical and Political Science, reviews. And in this chapter 5, it says fugitive servants. One of the most noticeable features of indentured servitude, and one which greatly impeded the successful operation of the institution, was the large number of runaways. All right, all these runaways, you thought it was just African slaves. No, it was indentured servants, large number of them, from the founding of the colony to the dying out of white servitude. From the very beginning, in the first half of the 19th century, there's abundant evidence that large numbers of servants deserted the service of their masters, and their apprehension was one of the most serious problems with which the planters had to deal. These slave catchers, who were they going after really? Indentured servants. When we consider the class of persons who made up the servant body and the conditions under which they were very often entered into servitude, we need not be surprised at the great number of fugitives. But on the contrary, we find ourselves wondering why there were not more. This desertion from service was due to several causes, and the blame attaches sometimes to the servant, sometimes to the master or the speculator, and very often to neither, but to the inherent evils of the institution itself. Often the servant, which when captured, gave as his reasons for running away that his master did not provide sufficient food and clothing or had treated him cruelly. Investigation sometimes proved this to be the case. At other times it was found to be only an excuse. Another class of servants ran away as soon as they discovered the deception that had been practiced upon them by the contractors who had induced them to come to America. They had been led to believe by accounts published in such tracts as Alsop's Character of the Province of Maryland, and from the stories of wealth, ease, and luxury told them by agents whose business it was to drum up recruits for transportation, that the life of a servant was an easy one, and that it was a stepping stone to fame and fortune. So this is the thing they were selling. Remember, they were going around with brochures over there. If you remember the past videos, we were talking about this a lot. They were going out there recruiting people, recruiting by the thousands. The American dream. It says these agents or crimps, writes Addis, who had often seen their advertisements in London, represent the advantages to be obtained in America, in colors so alluring that it is almost impossible to resist their artifices. Many of these immigrants had no intention of binding themselves to servitude, but were led by the agents to believe that laborers were so eagerly sought after and wages so high that they might, by hiring for a short time to some planter, pay back the passage money and go free. Outside of the convict class, by far the largest number of runaway came from the ranks of the outcast and ne'er-do-wells from the cities of England and Ireland. All right, these outcasts, many of them fleeing from justice or suffering from the pangs of hunger, were attracted by the glowing accounts given by the agents and eagerly accepted this method of reaching the land of gold. They were induced, they were forced, they were kind of like schemed into coming over here and putting themselves in an indenture.
It is not at all likely that these persons had any intention of fulfilling the conditions of the indenture and thought only of the free transportation to America. So a lot of these dudes are like, yeah, but when I get over there, first thing I'm doing is I'm running away. I'm escaping. I ain't working for 7 years. These and the convicts became the professional runaways. All right, the convicts and all these outcasts. These were the runaways, not no African slaves. You understand what we're reading here? Like, this is in Maryland, but this happened in the mass scale all over all these states where they had indentured servants. These same type of indentured servants, too, convicts and these outcasted people from Europe. From the publication of the first newspaper in Maryland till long after the Revolution, it is difficult to find a number whose columns do not contain from 1 to 10 advertisements for runaway servants. All right, we've seen a lot of examples of that already, right? All these newspapers during those times filled with runaway ads of servants, and a lot of them being described as what? Swarthy or dark complexioned, and they're like Irish, Scot, English, all this stuff, right? And it is apparent from the description given that they usually belong to this class. I have counted as many as 16 of these notices in a single issue of the Maryland Gazette from August 9, 1753. Go look it up. These advertisements for runaways throw much light upon various phases of servitude. Speedy apprehension depended to a great degree on an accuracy of description of the person, his mannerisms, his clothing, his nationality, and other details which can be found in no other. Says these advertisements show that by far the greatest number of fugitives were Irish, and next in order came the English. Now remember, when they're talking about all these Irish people, before these so-called Irish were being sent over to Americas, to the colonies in the West Indies and the colonies in North America or South America. Basically, there was a lot of other Europeans that were being outcasted in their own countries or their own homelands or wherever they were settled and being basically put in Ireland too. All these outcasts from Germany, from France, Scotland, England, they were sending them to Ireland. And then from there, they would send them over here. So a lot of them came in as Irish, but they might have been from other countries, is what I'm trying to say.
Because undoubtedly many of the working class whites, the descendants of working class whites in America, are therefore descendants of white slavery.
Absolutely, and especially in Appalachia, where you had the phenomenon of the so-called border southern whites, the whites who peopled West Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky. People like Andrew Johnson, who became a president of the United States. He was vice president under Lincoln. Andrew Johnson had been an indentured servant. He was an apprentice tailor. He was treated brutally. He ran away. I don't consider him a white slave in the technical sense, because by that period in America's history, it had moved into, as a mass phenomenon, into something that was more a temporary bondage. However, nevertheless, you did have the fact that a reward was posted for him. For a president of the United States, as a young man, a reward was posted, a wanted poster was issued, and he had to flee the state of Tennessee.
Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. 1773. Ran away from Amelia County a Negro man of the name of Tom, of yellowish complexion, much the appearance of an Indian. His hair is of different kind from that of a Negro's, rather more of the Indians, but partaken of both, with tuft short. He frequently ties behind. You hear what he's describing?
And it says here on the top, very expensive, says $100 reward. Ran away from the subscriber on the 16th instant, a Negro boy named George Stewart, a slave for life. The said boy is about 20 years of age, 5 feet in height, of a bright mulatto color. We know what that means. We've already read about how they were classifying a lot of the Indians as bright mulatto color. Had on when he left a pair of blue mixed pants, black foot coat, black hat, and coarse shoes. On the bottom it says run away from the subscriber at New Richmond in the district of Gaspee on Saturday the 29th of April. A Negro man named Jack or Isaac, who calls himself Charles sometimes. He is about 5 feet 8 or 10 inches high, speaks good English and some broken French and Mi'kmaq. He speaks Mi'kmaq. He probably is a Mi'kmaq.
It's called Levelers and Fugitive Runaway. advertisements in the contrasting political economies of mid-18th century Massachusetts and Pennsylvania by Barry Levi, University of Massachusetts, Amherst. Continuing, many old white servants had families that had been developed and grown in servitude. All right? Many white servants had families that had been what? Grown all their lives in what? Servitude. In this one regard, they were similar to black, so-called black people, Indian and other colored slaves. So no different than the so-called Negro, right? No different. Of course, some old white runaway families crossed racial lines. In short, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware clearly had a large group of permanently servile whites. All right, permanently servile whites, permanent. It wasn't just so-called black people being treated as chattel for life. People who lived their lives in servitude and who developed families likely to stay in servitude. Talking about white people here. And you know why they're saying white? Because these are all European indentured servants, so they gotta say white. But we don't know if they're all white. Many white children in Pennsylvania grew up in servile families. When Thomas Johnston, aged 30, ran from Thomas Ogle of Newcastle County, Delaware, in 1751, he took his wife, a little boy, about 4 or 5 years of age, with him. Similarly, when an Irish servant, Charles Campbell, ran from Henry Huddleston, Plumstead Township, Bucks County in 1739, he was supposed to be in company with one Martha Bostock, a short, well-set woman with red hair and poke broken, has a child with her about 5 years old. In 1741, Benjamin Mifflin of Philadelphia noted that his servant Henry Carpenter is a great boaster and has a son with him of his own name. This son was 13 years old. Like the stories of the slaves of the Old South, all right? Just like the stories of the slaves of the Old South, many white Pennsylvania servants ran to reunite their families. Such servants were not just German redemptioners seeking to reunite families soon after arriving. In 1746, Rachel Pickering, a 30-year-old English woman, fled from Matthias Curling, tavern keeper in Concord, Chester County, Pennsylvania. Curling noted that she had a fat man child with her about 6 months old. Curling had information that she was carried up from Newcastle County to Philadelphia in a boat, and that she had been heard to inquire of one Timothy Connor, who she says is her husband, but he is only her bastard's supposed father. He served his time with one William Peters. Fuller, living near Concord, the Delaware Valley free labor market, apparently disappointed and defeated many white ex-servants who returned to servitude after gaining freedom from the original labor contract and then decided to run later in life. Historians are beginning to uncover a class of lifelong servile white workers, and cottagers in the middle colonies, and these advertisements confirm these findings. All right, these advertisements, these are recorded history. It confirms these findings and this unusual and depressing feature of the middle colonies labor system. Between 1720 and 1760, over 35% of the runaway Delaware white men and women whose ages were specified were older than 24. Some of these were men who arrived at older ages to begin their American adventures. But as the advertisements make clear, most had served several terms of indenture in the middle colonies or in Maryland. They had failed to cultivate the discipline or skills of Poor Richard to compete well in an unregulated labor market. Some fell into debt or had to sell themselves into servitude contracts again to eat. All right, so it seems like a lot of these people didn't just, after their indenture was over, 7 years was over, they didn't just go get a farm and were successful. A lot of them didn't even have nothing to come up with, they didn't manage it right. They got broke, they spent their money, they invested it wrong, something happened, they got robbed, whatever. They had to sell themselves again into indenture so they can live, so they wouldn't starve and stuff, right? Pennsylvania welfare system and its economy rested on the sale as servants of the poorly behaved, undisciplined, and needy, if sometimes highly skilled men and women. Such as welfare system by white enslavement did not exist in New England, where the white poor were nurtured into independence, sometimes harshly, in a town setting. All right, continuing this book, and right here it talks about, how the runaways would do different things to escape and change their clothing and everything, so they would brand them, right? So it says here, in retaliation, Pennsylvania masters used tattoos to keep servants from simply shedding their clothes and thereby their historical identities. In all the New England and advertisements, not a single white runaway sported a tattoo. However, some 50 Pennsylvania white runaways had tattoos or brands imprinted on their bodies by their masters or merchant suppliers in order to deter escapes and aid in recaptures. Many servants, particularly from Quaker districts, had the initials of their names tattooed with gunpowder on their hands, usually the left hand near the thumb. Gunpowder tattoos were created by etching or cutting the skin with a needle and plugging the wounded skin with gunpowder. The burning procedure was not intensely painful, or so it is said. For example, Joseph Britton of Crosswick, New Jersey, reported that his runaway servant John Henry had J.H. picked with gunpowder on one of his hands. So that's what they mean, that they were branded. Masters tattooed women as well. Abraham Shelley of Philadelphia reported that his Irish runaway, Eleanor Kavanagh, alias Plunkett, aged 35, had EP and blue wrote in gunpowder on the back of her left hand. She is a good spinner. All right, so that was the code. The gunpowder was basically the tattoo, the brand they were putting on them. Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. 1753, ran away a mulatto girl of the Indian breed named Nancy, about 18 or 19 years old, has long black hair. Again, ran away a mulatto girl of the Indian breed named Nancy, has long black hair. 1761, ran away a mulatto wench named Betty. She is short and square, made, has short Indian hair, is well known in Charlestown. Says here, run away from the subscriber. The beginning of October last, a lusty, well-set mulatto man named Solomon, Hebrew name, Haynes, about 5 feet to 10 inches high, a very crafty fellow, intends to change his name, understands the water very well, and is exceedingly good pilot. 1771, ran away a young mulatto or musty wench named Mary, well known at Ashley River, where she formerly lived, and was enticed away by her mother, an Indian wench named Sarah, who lives at Stono Plantation. 1773, ran away a Negro man named Nero, and a mulatto or half-Indian man named Frank, well made, about 19 or 20 years old. So you see how many Indians are listed as slaves.
Oh, we got a runaway ad. Ran away from Captain McCarty's plantation on Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, a servant man belonging to the subscriber in Prince William County. His Christian name is John, but surname for God is Pretty Tall, a bricklayer by trade, and is a Kentish man. Kentish? He came into Potomac in the Forward Captain Major last year. All right? He came into Potomac. It's supposed to have the figure of Savior marked with gunpowder on one of his arms. They were doing that to the indentured servants. They were marking them up with gunpowder. He went away about 20th of April last in company with 3 other servants. Richard Martin is a middle-sized man, fresh-colored, about 22 years of age, and is a sailor. Had on a blue jacket. Richard Cable is middle-sized, young fellow, has several marks made of gunpowder on his arms, particularly on his breast, being the figures of a woman and cherry tree, and is a carpenter by trade. He wore a blue-gray coat with a large cape, a snuff-colored waistcoat, and buckskin breeches. Edward Ormsby is a small, thin fellow of a swarthy complexion, and is a tailor by trade, has a hesitation of stammering in his speech, and being an Irishman. All right, he's an Irishman. I know people are like, well, how do you know he's a European? Well, he's an Irishman. In his swarthy complexion, had a good deal of brogue. They went away from Captain Island's landing on Potomac in a small boat, and are supposed to be gone towards the eastern shore of North Carolina. Whoever will secure the said bricklayers, so that he may be again, shall have 5 pounds rewards beside what the law allows. All right, so they're like, please bring back my Irishman, please bring back my Irish swarthy man. Now, it says Virginia Gazette, Parks, Williamsburg, from August 10th to August 17th, 1730 1739, right? It says, ran away the 8th of July last from the subscribers living in Westmoreland County, 4 servant men, with John McHugh, Francis Mann, Daniel Fitzpatrick, and John Freelove. John McHugh is an Irish man of middle stature. He's swarthy complexion. He's an Irish man. John McHugh, remember the Mac, John McHugh is an Irish man. He has on one of his arms a bleeding heart pricked in gunpowder and name length, several other letters. All right, so okay, then we get Francis Mann. Francis Mann is an Englishman. All right, so now we got an Englishman, right? Not just an Irishman. We got a Briton, right? An Englishman, a middle stature, and he's also swarthy complexion, short brown hair, and yellowish rotten teeth. Damn, speaks quick and but we know, you know what they were saying about the Europeans. A lot of them that were coming here. There was a lot of the undesirables, a lot of the drunks, a lot of the peasants on the street. You know,
order of the bad.
It was like, yo, let's just send them over there. Let's just come on, hurry up, man. Let's get that swarthy peasant out of here. You know, that's what they were doing by massive numbers.
And certain fortunate whites, as well as fortunate blacks, because there were also free blacks who owned whites, free blacks who owned blacks, and blacks who were involved in an indentured system that was very humane and legitimate that I'm outlining here.
Now, how about this thing that there were free blacks that had white slaves?
Oh, yes. The early 17th century experience in America was one of, you would say, Reagan capitalism really prevailed in the 17th century in America. It was pretty much a capitalist domain, and it was an unregulated domain. And the idea that there was an ideology of white supremacy, which always protected poor white people and always gave them a higher station or status than blacks, is a tissue of falsehood. Because if you study the status of white slaves in Great Britain prior to the colonization and peopling of North America, you find that they were synonymous with a type of subhuman. That was the ideology of the ruling class in Great Britain. Now, that ideology didn't suddenly stop as soon as they confronted the experience of colonization in America. It was carried over. So there was a sense among the British aristocracy, who were now the governors of the crown colonies in British America, that if blacks were holding some individual whites in slavery or bondage, well, what the heck? These were, after all, poor whites, and this was their natural state.
$85 reward. Runaway since the 29th of January, 1851, the Negro Antoine, alias William, a well-known journeyman, baker, about 40 years of age, 5 feet 7 or 8 inches tall, yellowish complexion. Again, yellowish complexion. Who is the yellow man in history, right? Who are they calling the yellow man? All right. Strong constitution, large head, big nose, thick lips, large flat feet, a large burn scar on the chest, a piece of one ear bitten off, and speaking English and French.
Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes. 1777, ran away from Blandfield in Essex County, Negro man named John Topopens, 40 years of age, of a yellowish complexion, a good countenance. Topopens people were later regarded as Indians in neighboring King William's County. 1777, ran away from Amelia County, a large young mulatto fellow named Sam, of the Indian breed. I expect he is in James City County, as he has a mother who lives there.
All right, and it has an article here. Just wanted to read. Found it very interesting. It says Irish indentured servants in the colonies, and this is from J.D. Thomas. It says until the late 18th century, indentured servitude was very common in British North America. All right, again, repeated history here. It was often a way of poor Europeans to emigrate to the American colonies. They signed an indenture in return for a passage. After their indenture expired, the immigrants were free to work for themselves or another employer. In some cases, the indenture was made with a chips master who unsold the indenture to an employer in the colonies. All right, so then the chip master became like a in-between guy. He was making business out of it too, selling indentured servants. Most indentured servants worked as farm laborers. All right, farm laborers meaning hard labor in the tobacco fields, cotton fields too, sugar plantations. All right, we're not just talking about they're going to go do domestic work or crafts work, but they were also doing hard labor. Although some were apprenticed to craftsmen. All right, it says our 18th century newspaper collection includes the Pennsylvania Gazette and the South Carolina Gazette. Both newspapers carried many advertisements for the sale of indentured contracts and the recovery of runaway servants. All right, not just slave servants, indentured contracts. All right, so we're going to read some newspaper clips and you can verify these again from the Pennsylvania Gazette and the South Carolina Gazette in the years they specify. All right, now check this out. We're going to get into some interesting things here. All right, this is the main reason I wanted to show you guys this. So it says August 16, 1750. A runaway on the 12th instant from Joseph Jackson of London Grove, Chester County, an Irish servant man named William Farrell of middle stature and brown complexion. Brown complexion. Who? An Irish servant. We're talking about an Irish servant. He's not white. He's not pale. He's brown complexion. Aren't you brown complexion? So is this a white person or a so-called Negro? Anything would be up to conjecture, but we have a description of him clearly stating and describing him as brown complexion. All right? Had on when he went away, stripped flannel jacket, a brown sailor's jacket, a pair of coarse trousers, stripped drawers, a felt hat, and checkered shirt. His hair cut off. Likewise, all right, so it's going to say that he also ran away with somebody else. So it says, likewise, ran away with the aforesaid servant, an Irish servant, another Irish servant named Thomas Collard, all right, belonging to Samuel Ramsay of Londonderry. Samuel Ramsay, so that was his servant, in the said county of a dark complexion. So this Irish servant man, this other runaway, Thomas Collard, is of dark complexion. So his boy, Joseph, let me see, what's his name? William Farrell, who is brown complexion, ran away, right? With him, another English servant or Irish servant, sorry. And he's also of dark complexion. They're both colored people. So what are you going to take from dark complexion? I know you're going to say, well, oh, black means white, Kurimeo. All right, well, right here it says dark. It doesn't say black. I mean, yeah, black. It says dark complexion. What is dark complexion? All right, this is an Irish servant. These are the Negro Irish is what I'm trying to explain to you. They were sending also Irish Negroes, so-called Negroes, dark people of color, Irish people of color, indigenous people from Ireland over here. They were sending them over here too, along with the white people. Dark complexion. This is from 1750. It says, and his pock-marked, had on a green double-breasted jacket with clear buttons and red linen, black breeches, black wig. His other clothes not certainly known. Whoever takes up and secures the said servants, so that their masters may have them again, shall have £6 rewards for both, or £3 for either. All right, so you'll get paid by Joseph Jackson or Samuel Ramsay. Now, are these so-called Negroes? That's the other thing I want you guys to understand. We have to research all of that. Just because we think in their owners, slave owners, don't mean they're white.
Runaway from the subscribers, the 15th of September. 2 Irish indented servants, one named Maurice Croney, about 5 feet 8 inches high, of fair complexion with his own hair, wore a white shirt, a sailor's blue jacket, Osnaburg trousers, and shoes without stockings. His ankles are very much swelled. The other named Jeremiah Harrington, about 5 feet 5 inches high, has fair hair, had on a brownish colored coat, Osnaburg jacket and trousers, white worked stockings and shoes. Their conversation will convince any person that they are natives of Ireland. A reward of 20s, besides all reasonable expense, is offered for each to any person who will apprehend and bring them to Savannah. Joshua Von Peter Blyth.
Catholic missionary work among the colored people of the United States, 1776-1886. The source is records of the American Catholic Historical Society of Philadelphia, June 1924, volume 35. Says here, from the article by T.F. Meehan referred to above, we learned that there were 970 Negroes living among 4,848 whites. Dodge the hijack. What whites? Does that mean complexion? In New York in 1712. The year before, there had been a slave market on Wall Street, right? How did Wall Street really start? And not only were Negroes sold there, but also Catholic Indians were sold into slavery by reason of their color, which is swarthy. Can I get a so swarthy? Catholic Indians who were very swarthy. That's why they were being enslaved, because they were swarthy. The New Yorker said even did an advertisement for one of these Catholic Indians. Says, ran away 18th August 1733, a Negro Catholic who speaks very good English. You see how they left the Indian out? Do you guys see how they left the Indian out and they just put a Negro Catholic? But they were just making distinctions between Negroes and Indians, right? So now all of a sudden he's a Negro too. So what does Negro really mean, my people? When we're talking about statuses, freedom, when we're talking about when you own a land, you consider it a free person, what does it really mean?
That is. So I'm in Encyclopedia Britannica, Britannica.com website, and it says here that Benjamin Franklin, also called Ben Franklin, pseudonym Richard Saunders. Yeah, he had a different name because he had an almanac he used to write, and he would write it under this name, Richard Saunders, before he was, all famous and all that, So it says that 1706, Boston, Mass, and he died in 1790, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. American printer and publisher, author, inventor, and scientist and diplomat, yada, yada, yada. Yeah, we already know the story. Yeah, he supposedly invented electricity, right? Like we didn't have electricity in ancient times. Yeah, sure, Benjamin, aka Richard. Now let's get to the real story. Now I just wanted something that they don't teach us ever in school. So this is on Amazon. I wanted to find my own copy, but this is the best one I found. It's called Runaway America by David Waldstreicher. Benjamin Franklin, Slavery and the American Revolution. It says scientist, revolutionary, abolitionist. That is the Benjamin Franklin we know and celebrate. To this description, David Waldstreicher shows we must add runaway, slave master, and empire builder. All right. This author is saying that not only was he a scientist, revolutionary, and abolitionist, but he was also a slave master and a runaway. A runaway from what? He was a runaway. But Runaway America does much more than revise our image of a beloved founding father, finding slavery at the center of Franklin's life. Waldstreicher proves it was likewise central to the revolution, America's founding, and the very notion of freedom we associate with both. Franklin was the sole founding father who was once owned by someone else. Franklin was owned by someone else. As an indentured servant, Franklin fled his master before his term was complete. As a struggling printer, he built a financial empire selling newspapers that not only advertised the goods of slave economy, not to mention slaves themselves, but also ran the notices that led to the recapture of runaway servants. So even though he ran away, he still did it to other people. Perhaps Waldstreicher's greatest achievement in showing that this was not an ironic outcome but a calculated one. America's freedom no less than Franklin's demand that other forego liberty. All right, so I'm in this book. It's called Levelers and Fugitives, Runaway Advertisements, and the Contrasting Political Economies of Mid-18th Century Massachusetts and Pennsylvania. All right. It says in the early 19th century, Pennsylvania and Massachusetts had sharply different political economies and labor systems that were only partly blended with violence. These two political economies are reflected in various stories about Benjamin Franklin, who encountered a markedly different labor system when he moved from Boston to Pennsylvania. 17-year-old Franklin slipped out of Boston. All right, key, slipped. All right, we're going to talk about what do they mean by slipped out of Boston. Easily in 1723 by getting a friend to tell a sea captain that he impregnated a girl and wanted to leave quietly. The mariner thought it was more credible that young Franklin was running from a woman and her family than from a master. Say, what? Yeah, a master. He was an indentured servant. He was running away. He was a runaway. Few saw white servant runaways in 18th century Boston. White servant runaways. In the year Franklin ran, only 6 runaways inspired advertisements appeared in the Boston papers. 5 masters saw 3 men of color and 3 white men. In Boston, Franklin did not arouse suspicion. Upon arriving in the Delaware Valley, though less than 300 miles away, Franklin encountered a watchful society that created and then sought many black and especially white fugitives. Near Burlington, New Jersey, Franklin worried, "I cut so miserable a figure that I found by the questions asked me, I was suspected to be some runaway servant, and in danger of being taken up on that suspicion a few days later. While eating dinner at the Crooked Billet in Water Street, Philadelphia, several sly questions were asked me," wrote Franklin, "as it seemed to me suspected from my youth and appearance that I might be some runaway. It made sense to interrogate him. Delaware Valley masters in 1723 were looking for 26 white runaways. White runaways, white. This is history. You can verify this information, right? All whom had substantial bounties connected to them. Franklin might have been John A. Meyer of Joppa, Beeley, Charles Brown, John Cliff, Thomas Coombs, James Henson, Cornelius Lynch, Dennis McGinley, James McCurby, David Rees, or Richard Skelton, all advertised white men under 22 years of age who fled that year from masters in Pennsylvania. All right, white men, white runaways. All right, we're not talking about Africans here. New Jersey and Delaware, the Boston youth was new on the defensive. If he was held as a runaway, Franklin would have been sold as a servant by the gaoler for a term in order to pay the cost of his detention. He would need to beg his Boston family to come and bail him out. Franklin's migration from Boston to Philadelphia bears out 2 runaway stories, one well known and another hidden. In the known narrative, Franklin left a tired Primordian city in social order, Boston, that ridiculed, resented, and denied his youthful ambition, to resettle in an upwardly progressing, diversified city, Philadelphia, where self-fashioning was available to all white males, and where consequently Franklin gained wealth and worldwide fame. All right, so you heard that. So that was the story they told us when we were growing up in school of why he left Boston and ended up in Philadelphia, and that was the excuse. That was the reason they told us, right, to make it seem, sugarcoat what really happened. But the real reason, it says here, another story exists, however, as factual and believable, that highlights the power of working people in Boston and their weakness in Philadelphia. Briefly put, when the 17-year-old printer's apprentice and prodigy ran from his work brethren and family in Boston to Philadelphia in 1723, he left a society in which labor and work were carefully and politically empowered, protected, and dignified, for a society in which laborers had far less political and economic power and were therefore often oppressed by property holders. Franklin used Pennsylvania's exploitative labor regime and his Boston education to create a new persona.
$5 reward. Ran away from the subscriber on Tuesday last. A Negro fellow named Sam of a yellow complexion. So a Negro of a yellow complexion. About 5 feet 10 or 11 inches high and about 45 years of age.
Africans and Native Americans by Jack Forbes.
1785. Ran away from Dewey County, one Joe. He is a dark mulatto. He has bushy head of hair and is of an Indian breed. Again, a dark mulatto who has bushy hair, is of the Indian breed, is an excellent sawyer, plays on the violin, changed his name to Peter Tony.
British America, it says here, by John McGregor Esquire, in 2 volumes, volume 2. It says here, the descendants of the French settled in north side of the Bay, the Chaleur, are mostly Acadians, but from their intimate intercourse with Quebec, and the Canadians are a more intelligent people than the other Acadians, whom they, as well as the Canadians, denominate les savages. This appellation owing to some of the Acadians having, in consequence of their ancestors marrying Indian women. Acadians, right? Who's the Acadians? Huguenots, Moors marrying Indian women, the indication of Mi'kmaq blood apparent in their countenance. The Acadians have swarthy complexions. All right. The Acadians have what? Swarthy complexions. Kurimeo. What you talking about? Swarthy. What does Swarthy mean, Kurimeo? Black. Black complexion. The Acadians have black, Swarthy, dark, Swarthy, black. Moors are black, are Swarthy, right? Dark skinned, Swarthy. All right, let's go back. The Acadians have swarthy complexions, seldom fair hair, are generally well made, but the men are very rarely inclined to corpulency. The women are usually under the middle stature, with thick waists and ungainly figures. The features of their faces are, however, generally regular, with fine eyes and expressive countenances. Most Acadians were deported to various British American colonies. All right, where were they sent? Where many were put into forced labor or servitude. All right, there's actual sources for that. Were put into plantations. Acadians, did they ever tell you? So if Acadians are so-called pale-skinned people or white people, right? French white people, they never told us there was white French people in the plantations with so-called African slaves working together and escaping and trying to head north to Canada. Then that's where we get myths, right? All these myths of what people are, but they're just myths. It says the myth and the beginnings of French colonialism in the Americas, of the savage, the myth of the savages, and the beginning of French colonialism in the Americas. That's the book. While the policy of creating one race was doomed to failure in New France, as elsewhere, Amerindians and French were still distinct entities at the end of French regiment in 1760. Still, there was enough intermixing for a writer in South Carolina newspaper in 1742 to refer to the French as swarthy brethren of Amerindians. The French were what? Swarthy. They were black. The French were black brethren of Amerindians. Listen to this. Now we know they just described the Indians as swarthy, right? So swarthy Indians and swarthy French people, right? So if they come together, what do you think is going to happen? Listen to what happens. Shortly afterward, in 1753, Abbe Maillard noted that intermixing had already proceeded. So for that, in his opinion, in 50 years, it would be impossible to distinguish Amerindian from French in Acadia. It's impossible. Why? How could it be impossible? When we understand and overstand now why. Because they're both swarthy. They're both swarthy. They may look the same. They might have similar features. They might be anciently related. But either, what does it say here? Port Royal of Acadia. Upon their arrival at the ports where they were dumped off in Louisiana, they quickly assembled in small groups to attempt recapturing their lives and regrouping their families. They were not wanted by the people among which they were deposited, and they were forbidden to form large groups. This forced them into small clusters, among which an information pipeline was formed to pass word along as to who was where and what was happening. This forced them into small clusters among which an information pipeline was formed. This news highway soon became highly developed, with information being passed among the colonies and by ship sailors to other parts of the continent. It can be said with a high degree of reliability that from day of deposit on a strange shore, the Acadians continually attempted at regrouping and going back to the homeland they had been exiled from. They were trying to go back home, not because they were trying to go to freedom. They were trying to go back home. And listen to this, all right? Major drop. By spring of 1756, an underground highway leading north, perhaps the model of the Negro Underground Railroad during the American Civil War, had been established, with Acadians skirting the coastline of the Carolinas, Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, and New Jersey. All right, the model for the Negro Underground Railroad. All right, that was the model for the fake story. You get it? That's the model. That's what they used as the source for their fairy tales of African slaves running away, Harriet Tubman, all that stuff. This is the real story I'm telling you right now. All right? These fairy tales are based on real events. They add a lot of hijack. They give you a little bit of truth, but add a lot of hijack. All right? But this is the model for the Negro Underground Railroad.
Acadians going back home north, not because they were seeking freedom, because the North was free states. No, the North had so-called indentured servants to slaves. Don't get fooled. These activities resulted in the state of Massachusetts passing a law which said that the French neutrals living in large groups was a danger to the colony. Why? Why were these French neutrals, so-called aka French neutrals, Moorish people, right? Why were they such a threat? Think about that. A second law made it illegal for Acadians to cross the town lines of the communities they were sent to, which did not allow them to leave those towns and therefore restricted their movements. Even these laws did not discourage the constant attempts to go north. So I thought all these states in the north were harboring the runaway slaves and helping them. Gee, it wasn't always like that. That whole story, that's a whole fictional story. This is the General Evening Post from 1757. This is a newspaper ad about a soldier who deserted his military service, a deserter, right? Like, all right, from His Majesty 38, it says Jacob Erb. It says 5 feet 4 inches and a half, height, 23 of age, gray eyes, swarthy complexion, by trade a cordwainer, born in Frankfurt in Germany. All right, he's a German, a deserter, a German with swarthy complexion. He deserted, right? He's from Frankfurt, Germany. I said enlisted as the feathers in the Broadway, Westminster, deserted from recruiting party on the 13th of October, 1757. All right, and then we got Philip Benz. Philip Benz, 5 feet 5 inches and half, high, 26 years of age, gray eyes, also just like Lincoln. Remember, Lincoln was gray-eyed German too. Rather inclined to a swarthy complexion. He's also swarthy complexion. He's a needle maker, born in Saxony in Germany. All right, swarthy complexion. 2 Germans with swarthy complexions deserted the army in 1757. All right, swarthy Germans.
Now, why is this not being known more widely in America? Why is this being swept under the rug?
We have a gigantic industry in the United States and in the West which is determined to limit black people to a slave mentality, to tell them you've been slaves, and the only way you're ever going to get out of that is to rely on the slave mentality of the socialistic welfare democratic system, which is going to subsidize your manumission ever further. Well, as we know, no one ever gets out of his own bondage by someone else doing it for you. It's by your own work that you bring yourself out of bondage. Because certainly white slaves...
Yesterday